When the British entered Bergen Belsen in April 1945, they encountered no resistance. They found bodies, 13,000 decomposing corpses, more than 30,000 prisoners on the verge of death, and a typhus epidemic raging out of control. The Nazi officers surrendered without a fight. Among them were several young women in uniform, responsible for the camp's internal administration. They weren't assistants or mere subordinates. They had held positions of authority and assumed direct roles within the system of surveillance and punishment. Their presence in the camp was neither circumstantial nor symbolic, but an active part of the regime's functioning. For the British, that was enough to hold them responsible and bring them before a military tribunal. Who were these women? How did they come to occupy these positions? And what led the Allies to execute women for war crimes for the first time in their history? The liberation of Bergen Belsen, the horror revealed. The first weeks of April 1945 found the British 11th Armoured Division advancing through German territory as part of the final operations toward Allied victory. Its original mission was to secure the industrial routes of northern Germany and strategic crossings of the Elbe River, preparing the ground for the final assault on Hamburg. No officer in that military column anticipated that their route would lead them to one of the most shocking discoveries of the Second World War. The initial encounter occurred when a German detachment approached the British positions, waving a white flag of surrender. The commanding German officer explained that nearby was a military camp under SS administration where an uncontrollable typhus epidemic had broken out. The request was specific: to establish a local truce to prevent the fighting from spreading the disease beyond the confines of the camp. The British commanders, initially skeptical of this maneuver, which they considered dilatory, finally agreed to the inspection. The provisional agreement signed on April 13th stipulated that British troops could enter the area without armed resistance, provided they implemented immediate sanitary measures. What the Germans failed to reveal was the true nature of the facility they were surrendering. On April 15th, soldiers from the 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment became the first Allies to cross the main entrance to Bergen Belsen. Camp Commandant Josef Kramer, along with a small group of SS personnel who had remained at their posts, welcomed them with an attitude that oscillated between resignation and relief. The initial scene seemed almost routine: orderly military installations, lined barracks, seemingly ordinary administrative offices. However, the first inspection revealed a reality that surpassed any previous military preparation. More than 13,000 corpses lay scattered across the campgrounds, some piled in makeshift mounds, others scattered individually among the buildings. The bodies showed obvious signs of extreme malnutrition, with skeletons barely covered by skin. Many had open wounds, infected sores, and clear signs of physical violence. The barracks held tens of thousands of living prisoners, although their physical condition placed them on the brink of death. Men, women, and children lay on wooden planks or directly on the muddy floor, covered in excrement, urine, and dried blood. The stench was so intense that several British soldiers vomited immediately upon entering the buildings. Those prisoners who still retained some consciousness stared at the new arrivals with eyes that had lost all expression of humanity. The magnitude of the health disaster became clear when British military doctors conducted their initial assessments. The typhus epidemic had reached catastrophic proportions, spreading unchecked for months due to a complete lack of sanitary measures. Lice, the main vectors of the disease, infested every corner of the camp. There were no quarantine facilities, basic medicines, or even sufficient drinking water. British soldiers, facing a humanitarian crisis of this scale for the first time, improvised immediate responses. Sanitary cordons were established to separate the most seriously ill from those still able to stand. Massive disinfection efforts began using lime and readily available chemicals. Initial measures included shaving all survivors completely and burning their infested clothing. The logistics of the crisis became more complicated when it was discovered that deaths continued at a rate of 500 people a day, even after the liberation. The bodies of those who had survived the Nazi horror were now succumbing to their bodies' inability to assimilate food after months of starvation. British doctors, with no prior experience in cases of extreme malnutrition, made fatal errors by providing meals too rich in fat and protein. The transfer of less seriously ill survivors to the former Hohne military base became a massive rescue operation. For weeks, convoys of ambulances and military trucks evacuated nearly 30,000 people to better-equipped facilities. However, many could not withstand the sheer physical movement involved in the evacuation. The first weeks after liberation were characterized by a mixture of relief, horror, and despair. For the prisoners, the arrival of the British represented salvation, but their bodies could no longer recover from the damage inflicted by years of systematic abuse. For the Allied soldiers, Bergen Belsen became a tangible symbol of the barbarity they had fought during 6 years of war. The photographic and film documentation of these first weeks would later become crucial evidence in court. Cameramen from the British Army Film Service recorded every aspect of the horror: the corpses, the dying survivors, the sanitary conditions, the camp facilities. These images, though difficult to view, would provide irrefutable evidence for subsequent trials. The Belsen Trial, the first Holocaust trial. The establishment of the British military tribunal to try the crimes of Bergen Belsen represented a pivotal moment in international judicial history. For the first time, a Western military tribunal was faced with the task of prosecuting crimes that transcended the traditional categories of the law of war. The trial, held between September and November 1945 in Lüneburg, preceded even the famous Nuremberg trials and established fundamental legal precedents. The legal framework was based on the War Crimes Royal Act of 1945, which granted jurisdiction to British military tribunals to try violations of international law committed in territories under Allied occupation. Applicable legislation included the Hague Conventions of 1907 and the Geneva Conventions of 1929, supplemented by principles of customary international law prohibiting the mistreatment of civilian populations. The composition of the tribunal reflected the seriousness the British authorities attached to the case. Colonel R.B. Scott presided over a panel of 5 military judges, all career officers with experience in military law. The prosecution was presided over by Lieutenant Colonel M.P.E.M. Backhouse, accompanied by a team of prosecutors specializing in war crimes. This structure eliminated the participation of civilian juries, concentrating the responsibility for decisions on specifically trained judges. The 45 defendants represented a cross-section of personnel who had worked at both Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. The decision to jointly try crimes committed at both camps reflected the professional backgrounds of many of the defendants, who had been transferred between different facilities according to the needs of the Nazi apparatus. This judicial strategy allowed for a complete picture of individual participation in the concentration camp system. Among those prosecuted were commanders like Josef Kramer, supervisors of specific sections, medical personnel, administrative staff, cooks, and guards of various ranks. The inclusion of seemingly secondary personnel reflected a broad understanding of criminal responsibility, not only those who directly ordered, but also those who facilitated or permitted the commission of crimes could be considered guilty. The judicial process was characterized by meticulousness and transparency. The sessions were public, with extensive international press coverage. The right to defense was guaranteed, with military lawyers assigned to each defendant and some allowed to choose to defend themselves personally. Testimony was received under oath, both for the prosecution and for the defense, allowing cross-examination between the prosecution and defense. The evidence presented included administrative documents recovered from the camps, photographs taken during the liberation, footage shot by military cameramen, and, crucially, direct testimony from survivors. This combination of documentary and testimonial evidence established a standard of proof that would be replicated in subsequent trials. Survivors' testimony provided the emotional and factual core of the proceedings. Men and women who had endured years of torture, hunger, and humiliation appeared before the court to recount specific experiences. Their statements were not limited to general descriptions of the horror, but identified specific individuals, described particular incidents, and provided details that allowed for the establishment of personal responsibility. One of the most innovative aspects of the trial was the recognition of criminal responsibility by omission. It was not necessary to prove that a defendant had directly killed prisoners. It was sufficient to demonstrate that they had facilitated, permitted, or deliberately ignored crimes committed under their supervision. This doctrine significantly expanded the scope of international criminal justice. The defense strategies followed patterns that would be repeated in subsequent trials. Most of the defendants pleaded due obedience, arguing that they were merely following superior orders without the capacity to make autonomous decisions. Others denied knowledge of the most serious crimes, claiming their duties were purely administrative. Some attempted to portray themselves as victims of the system, forced to participate against their will. The court consistently rejected these defenses when it found them inconsistent with the evidence presented. It held that due obedience did not excuse responsibility when the orders involved manifest crimes against humanity. Ignorance was deemed inadmissible when the defendants held positions that gave them direct access to information about the crimes. The court's deliberations stretched over weeks, assessing the specific evidence against each defendant on a case-by-case basis. The criteria applied included the degree of direct involvement in the crimes, the hierarchical position held, the demeanor displayed during the trial, and the consistency of multiple independent testimonies. The sentences, handed down on November 17, 1945, established a gradation of responsibility. 11 defendants, including Joseph Kramer and 3 female guards, were sentenced to death. The remaining sentences ranged from 1 year to life imprisonment, depending on the proven degree of involvement in the crimes. The grounds for capital sentences were based on direct participation in multiple murders, supervision of systematic torture, and the creation or maintenance of deliberately lethal conditions for prisoners. Lesser sentences were applied to those who, although involved in the operation of the system, could not be directly linked to specific deaths. The historical significance of the Belsen trials goes beyond its immediate results. It established crucial precedents for the development of international criminal law, including the recognition of crimes against humanity as a specific legal category, the acceptance of victim testimony as valid evidence, and individual responsibility for crimes committed within complex organizational structures. The Hamelin executions, British justice with a rope. Planning the executions of those condemned in the Belsen trials required administrative coordination unprecedented in British judicial history. Military authorities faced the challenge of carrying out 11 capital sentences simultaneously, while respecting both British legal protocols and international expectations for impartial justice. Hamelin Prison was selected as the execution site due to its adequate infrastructure and strategic location within the British zone of occupation. Logistical preparations began immediately after the sentences were handed down. A specially designed double gallows was built to the specifications of Pentonville Prison in London, but adapted to allow for multiple executions in a concentrated period. The structure was installed in an isolated wing of the main building, completely separate from the rest of the prison facilities to ensure security and control of the proceedings. Security measures included completely restricting access to unauthorized personnel, establishing direct communications with the regional military command, and preparing medical protocols for certifying deaths. Specific officers were designated to oversee every aspect of the procedure, from the transfer of the condemned to the subsequent disposal of the bodies. Albert Pierrepoint, the official executioner of the United Kingdom, was specially flown in from England to supervise the executions. His selection was not only based on his technical expertise, but also on his reputation for efficiency and professionalism. Pierrepoint had developed a precise calculation method to determine the exact length of the fall required for each condemned man based on factors such as weight, height, build, and age. The technique used, known as the long drop method, sought to cause an immediate fracture of the cervical vertebrae, ensuring a quick death and reducing suffering. This method required precise mathematical calculations. An insufficient drop would result in death by strangulation, while an excessive drop could cause decapitation. Pierrepoint performed these measurements during the days leading up to the execution, discreetly weighing and measuring each condemned man. The execution protocol followed an inflexible sequence developed over decades of use in the British penal system. Each condemned man was escorted individually from his cell to the execution chamber, where a white hood was placed over his head before being positioned over the trapdoor. The rope was secured with a specific knot placed behind the left ear to maximize the effectiveness of the cervical fracture. The executions were carried out in the order established by military protocol, beginning with the 3 condemned women and continuing with the remaining 8 men. This sequence responded to both practical and symbolic considerations. The executions of women required the presence of a female prison officer, and carrying them out first allowed for a more efficient process. The support staff included Sergeant Major Richard Anthony O'Neill and Sergeant James Hunter, who assisted in restraining the condemned prisoners and handling technical procedures. A military doctor certified each death, and a chaplain offered spiritual assistance to those who requested it. The presence of these officers ensured compliance with the humanitarian standards established by international conventions. The morning of December 13, 1945, marked a milestone in British penal history. In less than 4 hours, 11 people, 8 men and 3 women, were executed by hanging at Hamelin Prison. Leading the process was Albert Pierre Point, the official executioner of the United Kingdom, whose efficiency and discretion had made him the central figure of the British execution system since the war. The 11 executions not only represented the end of an unprecedented judicial sequence, they also constituted the largest number of consecutive capital punishments carried out on a single day under British jurisdiction since the 19th century. Each execution was carried out individually, without outside spectators, and with just enough time to ensure medical and legal verification before proceeding to the next. The planning was meticulous, and the sequence was precisely timed. Official witnesses were present throughout the proceedings, representatives from the War Office, 2 military doctors, an officer from the British Zone Military Government, and a legal scribe who certified each phase of the process were present. This observation structure ensured that all executions met the legal requirements established by the Allied Occupation Administration. After death, each body was identified, photographed, and documented according to instructions received from London. Allied authorities established a strict protocol for the handling of the remains. The bodies were cremated under military custody in a nearby crematorium without ceremony or returned to relatives. This measure was intended to prevent any future commemoration or symbolic appropriation by Nazi sympathizers. The Hamelin case was not just a mass execution, it was a precise judicial operation, designed to close a chapter of Nazi horror with legal precision, absolute control, and no room for spectacle. In this case, justice did not seek exemplary punishment, but absolute compliance with the judgment handed down in the name of international law. The executions were completed in a period of approximately 4 hours on the morning of December 13, 1945. The efficiency of the process reflected both Pierre Point's meticulous preparation and technical expertise. No significant incidents were recorded, and all the condemned men died apparently instantly according to official medical certificates. Official documentation of the executions included detailed records of each procedure, individual death certificates, and administrative reports on the overall progress of the process. This documentation was preserved for both legal and historical purposes, establishing a precedent for transparency in the application of international military justice. Media coverage of the executions was controlled but significant. Although journalists were not allowed to attend the proceedings themselves, official statements detailing the results were issued. The British and international press covered the event extensively, emphasizing both the conclusion of the trial and the symbolism of justice served against Nazi crimes. Public reaction to the executions was largely favorable in the United Kingdom and Allied countries. Public opinion perceived the executions as a proportionate response to crimes of exceptional magnitude. However, debates also arose over the use of capital punishment against women, an issue that generated controversy in some political and religious circles. Post-execution procedures included cremating the bodies in facilities near the prison, following strict health protocols. The ashes were not given to relatives or preserved for commemoration, reflecting the authorities' intention to prevent the creation of symbols or pilgrimage sites for Nazi sympathizers. The experience of the Hamelin executions established protocols that would later be applied in other war crimes cases. The combination of technical efficiency, respect for legal procedures, and administrative transparency became the standard for the application of capital justice in international contexts. The legacy of these executions transcends their immediate significance as the application of justice. They represented the practical realization of the principles established at the Belsen trials. Individual responsibility for crimes against humanity could not go unpunished, regardless of the perpetrator's rank, gender, or nationality. Irma Gries, the frozen face of sadism. The most disconcerting psychological phenomenon of the Gress case lay not in its brutality, but in the speed of her moral transformation. In less than 4 years, a teenager with no history of previous violence became what British psychiatrists would describe as a clinical specimen of pure sadism. Her case forced a reconsideration of contemporary theories about the nature of human evil. The first signs of psychological distortion appeared during her childhood in Rechen. Irma displayed a morbid fascination with the death of small animals, a characteristic her siblings would later recall as strange but not alarming. When she found injured birds, rather than helping or ignoring them, she would deliberately prolong their agony. This early behavior suggested the presence of latent sadistic impulses that remained hidden until they found the appropriate context to manifest themselves. The family catastrophe that marked her adolescence, her mother's suicide by poisoning, not only traumatized her emotionally, but fundamentally altered her perception of human mortality. Medical records from the sanatorium where she later worked indicated that she displayed an abnormal clinical indifference to the suffering of patients. This emotional detachment constituted the psychological foundation upon which her later criminal behavior would be built. Her relationship with authority revealed patterns that would explain her enthusiastic adaptation to the concentration camp system. Irma didn't simply obey orders, she anticipated them, interpreted them expansively, and systematically exceeded them. Supervisory reports at Ravensbrück noted her exceptional initiative in the application of punishments, an administrative euphemism that masked her tendency to invent unauthorized torture. The most disturbing aspect of her psychology was the connection she made between violence and sexual gratification. Confidential testimony from other SS members indicated that Gress experienced visible physical arousal during the most severe beatings. This sexualization of cruelty distinguished her even among the most brutal camp personnel, creating a unique category of perversion that combined sadism, necrophilia, and exhibitionism. Her method of selecting victims followed patterns that revealed the complexity of her psychological motivations. She didn't attack randomly, but rather chose prisoners who exhibited specific characteristics: youth, residual beauty, signs of previous education, or manifest spiritual resilience. This selectivity suggested that her attacks sought to destroy precisely those human elements that represented what she herself had lost or had never possessed. The evolution of his torture techniques displayed a sinister creativity that went beyond the simple application of violence. He developed methods that maximized psychological humiliation in addition to physical pain. He forced mothers to witness the torture of their daughters, forced acts of sexual degradation among prisoners, and created situations where victims were forced to choose between different forms of suffering. Her relationship with the trained dogs revealed even more disturbing aspects of her fragmented personality. The animals responded to her voice and gestures with an obedience she had never achieved from humans. This interspecies connection gave her a sense of absolute control that compensated for her deep personal insecurities. The dogs became extensions of her will, executors of a violence she directed, but from which she could emotionally distance herself. Analysis of his behavior during his final months at Bergen Belsen suggests that he had developed a psychological addiction to violence. As camp conditions deteriorated and opportunities for control diminished, his attacks became more frequent and extreme. He seemed to require increasing doses of cruelty to maintain the same level of psychological satisfaction. Her failure to recognize the gravity of her actions during the trial did not represent a calculated defense strategy, but rather a genuine disconnect from moral reality. The psychiatrists who evaluated her noted a complete absence of guilt or remorse, characteristics that placed her on the spectrum of the most severe antisocial personality disorders. The question her case raises transcends traditional legal categories. Was Irma Gries a product of extraordinary circumstances or an inherently corrupt individual who found the perfect context to express her nature? The evidence suggests a combination of both, pre-existing psychological vulnerabilities magnified by a system that not only permitted but rewarded the most extreme expression of destructive impulses. His death at the age of 22 closed the story of a mind that had achieved the perfect synthesis between genocidal ideology and individual pathology, creating a form of evil that defied both academic understanding and conventional justice. Volkenrath and Bormann, two routes to the same gallows. Elisabeth Volkenrath and Johanna Bormann represented two opposing archetypes of Nazi female criminality who met the same fate, the gallows. Their combined analysis reveals how the extermination apparatus absorbed completely different personalities and transformed them into equally lethal instruments, albeit through distinct psychological mechanisms. Volkenrath embodied the banalization of evil that Hannah Arendt would describe decades later. His criminality arose not from personal sadism but from administrative efficiency applied to genocidal tasks. He had transformed mass murder into a routine process where victims became statistics and life-or-death decisions were made with the same coldness as a commercial inventory. His specialization in the Auschwitz selections revealed a mind capable of applying seemingly rational criteria to inherently irrational processes. He developed categorization systems that optimized the extermination process: age, physical condition, job suitability, signs of resistance. This systematization allowed him to process thousands of lethal decisions without experiencing the emotional collapse that affected less structured personnel. The preserved administrative correspondence showed his signature on documents authorizing mass transports to the gas chambers, with marginal notes revealing a purely logistical mindset. Reduce numbers due to limited capacity, prioritize medical cases for rapid disposal, coordinate with crematorium schedules. These phrases illustrated a moral corruption deeper than explosive violence, the conversion of genocide into a bureaucratic procedure. Her rise within the Nazi hierarchy was based not on visible brutality, but on organizational competence. Supervisory reports described her as extremely reliable, results-oriented, and capable of maintaining discipline without emotional overreach. This positive assessment of genocidal efficiency revealed how the system rewarded systematic criminality over individual violence. Bormann, by contrast, represented an instinctive criminality that had found the perfect context for expression in the Nazi apparatus. Her advanced age at the time of her induction, 45, meant that she had not been molded by youthful indoctrination but had consciously chosen to participate in the system for reasons that transcended ideology. His relationship with dogs revealed aspects of his personality that predated his enlistment in the SS. Residents of his hometown later recalled that he had always displayed a special affinity with aggressive animals, and that he had previously worked in a slaughterhouse where he was known for his insensitivity to animal suffering. This background suggested predispositions that the concentration camp system simply channeled toward human targets. The methodology he developed for using dogs as weapons revealed an intuitive understanding of the psychology of terror. He used animals not only to cause physical harm, but to create spectacles of horror that maximized the psychological impact on other prisoners. Victims were selected for their visibility, not for specific infractions, turning each attack into a public lesson on the consequences of resistance. Medical records of victims of dog attacks directed by Bormann showed injury patterns that suggested deliberate prolongation of suffering. The bites were concentrated in areas that caused maximum pain without immediate death, allowing the victims to agonize for days while serving as living examples of terror. Her behavior during the selections differed radically from Volkenrath's administrative method. While the latter applied seemingly objective criteria, Bormann made decisions based on momentary impulses, personal dislikes, or simply whims. This arbitrariness made her especially feared because the prisoners could not develop survival strategies based on predictable behaviors. The contrast between the two personalities became clear during their respective interrogations. Volkenrath maintained a professional demeanor, provided technically accurate answers, and demonstrated detailed knowledge of administrative procedures. Her strategy was to present herself as a competent official who had carried out orders without questioning their moral content. Bormann, on the other hand, displayed genuine confusion about why she was being tried. Her limited understanding of the legal implications of her actions contrasted with her detailed knowledge of the torture techniques she had employed. This dissociation between practical competence and moral incomprehension illustrated a different form of psychological corruption. An analysis of their respective sentences reveals how the court assessed these two types of criminality. Volkenrath was convicted primarily for her systematic participation in mass murders, with an emphasis on the premeditation and planning that characterized her crimes. The sentence recognized that her administrative efficiency had been fundamental to the functioning of the extermination apparatus. Bormann was convicted of specific acts of torture and murder which, although less numerous than Volkenrath's crimes, were considered particularly cruel due to their prolonged and spectacular nature. The court recognized that her criminality, although less systematic, had caused suffering that went beyond mere physical elimination. Their simultaneous executions symbolized the judicial system's determination not to establish moral hierarchies between different forms of participation in genocide. Both bureaucratic efficiency and instinctive cruelty deserved the same punishment when they served genocidal purposes. The legacy of both cases illustrates the diversity of motivations and personalities that the Nazi apparatus managed to incorporate into its extermination machinery. The fundamental historical lesson is that genocide requires not only ideological fanatics or pathological sadists, but can also absorb and corrupt seemingly normal individuals through various psychological and social mechanisms. Incomplete trial when the sentence did not reach the crime. The judicial decisions that saved Herta Ehlert, Herta Botha, and Irene Haschke from execution reveal the ethical and evidentiary complexities that courts faced when assessing criminal responsibility. Their cases illustrate how seemingly minor factors, age, rank, availability of specific testimony, determined the difference between life and death in contexts of extraordinary justice. The most disturbing paradox of these cases is that the three condemned women who escaped execution could, individually, have caused more direct suffering than some of those executed. However, the nature of the available evidence, the specific circumstances of their crimes, and the limitations of the judicial process created a situation where moral culpability and legal punishment did not necessarily coincide. Herta Ehlert represented the most complex case from the perspective of the degree of culpability. Her transformation from a Berlin baker to a brutal supervisor illustrated how systematic indoctrination could corrupt seemingly stable personalities. Records of her training period under Theodora Binz revealed a calculated progression, from initial resistance to enthusiastic adoption of extreme methods. His case raised fundamental questions about individual responsibility versus institutional conditioning. Psychiatric reports prepared for trial indicated that he had developed a functional dissociation that allowed him to commit acts of extreme cruelty while maintaining a self-image as a fundamentally decent person. This psychological compartmentalization complicated traditional assessments of criminal culpability. Specific testimony against Ehlert revealed patterns of behavior that transcended simple obedience to orders. She had developed personal innovations in punishment techniques, created systems of humiliation not found in official manuals, and shown initiative in increasing the suffering of prisoners under her supervision. These characteristics suggested an active and creative participation in the apparatus of oppression. The decision to sentence her to 15 years instead of death was based partly on considerations of her relative age and the absence of direct evidence of involvement in specific murders. However, subsequent testimony that emerged after the trial suggested that this distinction between severe abuse and direct murder was artificial in contexts where systematic abuse effectively amounted to deferred homicide. His early release in 1953 sparked controversy that persisted for decades. Survivors' organizations argued that 8 years of imprisonment constituted insufficient punishment for crimes that had destroyed thousands of lives. The decision reflected broader reconciliation policies that prioritized the stabilization of West Germany over the full satisfaction of demands for justice. Herta Botha embodied a different kind of criminality that defied traditional legal categories. Her youth at the time of the crimes, 24 years old, raised expectations of potential rehabilitation that contrasted dramatically with the evidence of her behavior. Medical records of victims under her supervision documented injuries that suggested deliberate sadism rather than routine discipline. Forensic analysis of the instruments he used to punish prisoners revealed personal modifications that increased the damage caused. He had sharpened the edges of work tools, added sharp elements to standard truncheons, and developed striking techniques that maximized bone fractures. These innovations indicated a mentality that found satisfaction in perfecting methods of inflicting suffering. His behavior during pretrial interrogations displayed characteristics that psychiatrists classified as severe emotional instability with explosive tendencies. The episodes alternated between complete denial of responsibility and outbursts of rage in which he graphically described the violence he had inflicted. This emotional inconsistency complicated assessments of his capacity for moral understanding. The testimony against Botti included particularly disturbing descriptions of sexual violence he had inflicted on prisoners as a form of personal entertainment. These acts, which were not part of official camp protocols, revealed a sinister creativity in the application of humiliation that transcended institutional expectations. The 10-year sentence he received reflected the court's consideration of mitigating factors related to his age and the extreme pressure of the final period at Bergen Belsen. However, his release in 1951, after only 6 years, sparked international protests questioning the consistency of the justice system applied to minor war criminals. His appearance in the media decades later revealed a persistent inability to grasp the moral gravity of his actions. In television interviews in the 1980s, he maintained justifications based on superior orders and extraordinary circumstances, demonstrating that his imprisonment had not produced genuine moral reflection on his participation in mass crimes. Irene Haschke represented the most disturbing category of perpetrators, individuals whose cruelty seemed to stem from personal impulses rather than institutional pressure. Her relatively minor position in the camp hierarchy, a kitchen supervisor with no formal authority over life or death decisions, contrasted with testimonies describing her as one of the guards most feared by the prisoners. The pattern of their attacks revealed characteristics that contemporary criminologists would associate with severe personality disorders. They were not in response to specific violations of camp rules, nor did they follow established disciplinary protocols. Instead, they seemed to arise from internal emotional states that the prisoners could neither predict nor avoid. Medical records of victims of his attacks showed injuries concentrated in areas that caused the greatest pain without causing immediate death: joints, internal organs, nerve endings. This anatomical selectivity suggested specific knowledge about how to prolong suffering, possibly derived from undocumented prior experience with interpersonal violence. His control over food distribution provided him with additional opportunities to exercise arbitrary power. Testimony indicated that he developed a personal system of food punishments that included denial of rations, deliberate contamination of food, and forced consumption of non-food substances as a form of humiliation. Research into her life prior to serving in concentration camps revealed episodes of domestic violence and animal abuse that had been ignored by local authorities. This background suggested that the concentration camp system had not corrupted her, but rather provided a context where pre-existing impulses could be expressed without legal consequences. His 10-year sentence was based on specific evidence of involvement in deaths by forced starvation and deliberate poisoning. However, the absence of testimony regarding direct murder, a result of most of his victims being dead, limited the court's ability to impose harsher sentences. Haschke's complete disappearance from the public record after her release in 1951 illustrated the limitations of the system for tracking minor war criminals. Unlike high-profile figures who remained under international observation, perpetrators like her were able to anonymously reintegrate into post-war German society. A combined analysis of these three cases reveals fundamental tensions in the application of justice to mass crimes: evidentiary limitations, proportionality considerations, and broader political goals of reconciliation created situations where individuals responsible for extreme suffering received punishments that many observers considered inadequate. The survival of these three women, while others equally guilty were executed, raises persistent questions about the criteria used to assess responsibility in contexts of systematic criminality. Their subsequent stories, early releases, social reintegration, absence of moral reflection, suggest that the post-war justice system prioritized practical considerations over demands for full retribution. The legacy of these cases illustrates the complexities inherent in any attempt to apply proportional justice to crimes that transcend ordinary moral and legal categories. The survival of lesser perpetrators, while innocent victims had perished by the millions, represents one of the bitterest ironies of the period of European reconstruction. Revenge of the living, the other side of liberation. The first days after the liberation of Bergen Belsen generated situations that challenged traditional categories of military justice and public order. The simultaneous presence of traumatized victims, captured perpetrators, and overwhelmed liberators created a complex social dynamic where institutional responses interacted with impulses for individual revenge and popular justice. The lynchings of capos and collaborators began spontaneously when the prisoners realized that Nazi power had finally collapsed. These episodes were not centrally organized, but rather arose from individual and group decisions by prisoners who had identified specific torturers among their fellow prisoners. The methods employed in these summary executions reflected both the desperation accumulated over years of abuse and the temporary absence of effective authority. Documented cases included improvised hangings, collective beatings that continued until death, and, in some incidents, the burning of collaborators in abandoned barracks. British authorities faced immediate decisions about whether or not to intervene in these acts of revenge. Commanding officers recognized the emotional legitimacy of the survivors' responses, but also understood the need to restore legal order. The solution adopted consisted of targeted interventions that prevented the most extreme excesses while allowing for a degree of mob justice. This unofficial policy of limited tolerance responded to both practical and moral considerations. British military resources were insufficient to provide full protection to all captured Nazi personnel, and there was an intuitive understanding that survivors had a moral right to some form of immediate satisfaction. British documentation of these episodes was deliberately limited. Official reports downplayed the extent of the violence and emphasized efforts to restore order, but private correspondence between officials revealed recognition that some degree of retaliation was inevitable and possibly justifiable. The procedures for disposing of corpses became instruments of symbolic justice as well as practical health needs. The decision to force captured SS personnel to bury victims with their own hands represented a form of punishment that preceded and complemented formal judicial proceedings. The conditions imposed during these forced labor sessions were deliberately harsh. No gloves, protective masks, or proper tools were provided. Nazi guards were forced to handle decomposing corpses for full shifts under armed supervision and threatened with physical punishment if they showed resistance or displeasure. Exposure to typhus during these burial operations led to the deaths of several Nazi personnel, including some female guards. The British authorities failed to provide priority medical treatment to these individuals, allowing the diseases to run their natural course as a form of biological justice. The images captured during these proceedings served multiple functions: documentation for subsequent legal proceedings, evidence that the perpetrators had been forced to confront the consequences of their actions, and propaganda material demonstrating the Allied determination to enforce justice. The moral dilemmas faced by British officers during these weeks reflected fundamental tensions between different conceptions of justice. Traditional military law required orderly trials and proportionate punishments, but the extraordinary circumstances of Bergen Belsen seemed to warrant responses that transcended normal legal precedents. Decisions regarding the treatment of sick Nazi prisoners illustrated these tensions. While some officials argued that humanitarian standards required universal medical care, others argued that providing care to perpetrators while victims continued to die represented an unacceptable moral distortion. Military chaplains accompanying British forces faced particular theological challenges. Their responsibilities included providing spiritual comfort to both victims and perpetrators, but many found it impossible to reconcile these obligations with their emotional responses to the horror they had witnessed. Correspondence between British officials during this period revealed explicit recognition that the circumstances of Bergen Belsen existed beyond ordinary moral categories. Terms such as exceptional justice and punishment proportional to the crime frequently appeared in discussions of appropriate policy. The systematic attempts by Nazi personnel to destroy files in the days leading up to the liberation added an additional dimension to Britain's ethical dilemmas. Evidence that the perpetrators had anticipated trials and attempted to suppress evidence of their crimes strengthened arguments for punitive measures that went beyond standard legal procedures. The still-hot ovens found during the liberation, where administrative documents, prisoner lists, and execution orders were burning, provided tangible evidence of criminal intent and an attempt to evade responsibility. This evidence influenced British decisions about the treatment of captured personnel. Between April and May 1945, more than 17,000 bodies were buried in mass graves at Bergen Belsen. This task wasn't carried out by Allied soldiers, it was by the perpetrators themselves. SS guards, female collaborators, and German prisoners from the camp were forced to dig, transport, and bury the bodies under the strict supervision of the British Army. The work was done without gloves, without masks, without sufficient shovels. Some used their bare hands. This wasn't just a sanitary task. It was a direct, deliberate, and silent way of confronting the perpetrators with the physical results of their actions. The order came from the British 11th Armoured Division Command and was carried out under armed guard. Those who refused were threatened or forcibly removed. The stench was unbearable. The terrain was infested with typhus and the corpses had been decomposing for weeks. Several Nazi personnel died during these days, victims of the same typhus they had refused to contain while in power. At the same time, the first episodes of spontaneous revenge began. Survivors identified capos, collaborators, and guards infiltrated among the prisoners. As soon as they recognized them, they attacked them. Lynchings, mass beatings, and even the burning of barracks with collaborators inside were reported. The British Army, outnumbered and facing a logistical crisis of catastrophic proportions, did not intervene immediately. In many cases, they allowed these acts of immediate justice, not out of laziness but out of realism, and because they knew that for many prisoners, this would be the only justice possible. Everything was filmed. The British Army Film and Photographic Unit, sent by direct order of the Allied High Command, documented every stage of the process. Official cameramen recorded the burials, the scenes of revenge, the orders of British officers, and the faces of the perpetrators carrying lifeless bodies. These images would later be used in the Belsen trials and broadcast on newsreels as irrefutable evidence of what had happened there. They were also archived in London, Berlin, and The Hague as part of the official historical record of the collapse of the Nazi system. What began as a sanitation operation transformed into a symbolic act of justice. The bodies were buried by those who had let them die. History, for once, was written with shovels, not words. The destruction of files was not chaotic but systematic, following priorities that protected higher-ranking officers while sacrificing documentation that could incriminate subordinate personnel. This selectiveness revealed a criminal calculation that justified harsher British responses. Dilemmas surrounding intervention in cases of mob revenge were complicated by the recognition that many survivors would never have the opportunity to testify in formal court proceedings due to their physical condition or imminent death. Immediate revenge might represent their only chance of obtaining any form of justice. The policies developed during these weeks at Bergen Belsen set precedents for similar situations in other subsequently liberated camps. The balance between legal order and popular justice, between institutional procedures and emotional responses, influenced the British approach in multiple contexts for the remainder of the war. The ethical questions raised by these experiences would resonate in discussions of international justice for decades to come. The relationship between legal processes and moral satisfaction, between individual guilt and collective responsibility, between punishment and rehabilitation, would remain central themes in international criminal law.